The gunshot that shattered Katherine Dalton's world didn't come from a six-shooter or a rifle, but from her father's mouth when he told her she'd be marrying her cousin Jacob in 2 weeks' time, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. The year was 1878, and Kennewick, Washington Territory, was a small settlement where family ties meant everything, where land stayed in bloodlines, and where a woman's worth was measured by her obedience. Katherine had always known her family was different, isolated on their sprawling cattle ranch 10 miles outside town, but she never imagined they'd demand this of her. She stood in the parlor of the ranch house, her hands trembling at her sides, staring at her father's weathered face. "I won't do it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "Jacob is my cousin. It's wrong." Her father, Thomas Dalton, slammed his fist on the oak table. "It's tradition in this family. Your grandmother married her cousin and her mother before that. It keeps the land together, keeps our legacy intact." "I don't care about legacy," Katherine said, lifting her chin. "I won't marry Jacob. I won't." Her mother sat in the corner, silent as always, her eyes downcast. Katherine searched for support there and found nothing. Her two younger brothers stood by the fireplace, looking anywhere but at her. Jacob himself leaned against the doorframe, a cruel smile playing at his lips. He was 22, 4 years older than Katherine, and he'd always looked at her in a way that made her skin crawl. "You'll do as you're told," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Or you'll leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back." Katherine felt the weight of that threat. Women didn't survive alone in the Washington Territory. The land was harsh, the winters brutal, and a woman without family or money was as good as dead. But when she looked at Jacob, saw the possessiveness in his eyes, she knew she'd rather face the unknown than spend her life as his wife. "Then I'll leave," she said. The silence that followed was deafening. Her mother let out a small gasp. Her brothers finally looked at her, shock written across their young faces. Thomas stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Get out," he said. "Get out of my house. You're no daughter of mine." Katherine didn't wait for him to change his mind. She walked to her room, packed a small bag with 2 dresses, her mother's old shawl, and the silver locket her grandmother had given her before she died. She had $12 she'd saved from selling eggs in town, hidden in her hat box. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. When she came back downstairs, her mother pressed a small bundle into her hands. Inside was bread, dried beef, and an extra $10. "I'm sorry," her mother whispered. "I'm so sorry." Katherine kissed her mother's cheek and walked out of the only home she'd ever known. The road to Kennewick was dusty and long. Katherine walked for 3 hours in the August heat, her feet aching in her worn boots, her throat dry as sand. She'd made this journey dozens of times in the wagon, but never on foot, never alone, never as an outcast. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she pulled her bonnet lower to shield her face. She was halfway to town when she heard the sound of hoofbeats behind her. Her heart seized. Had her father come after her? Had Jacob? She turned, shading her eyes against the sun. The rider wasn't her father. He was a stranger, tall in the saddle, wearing a dusty brown hat and a blue shirt faded from too many washings. As he drew closer, she could see he was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and eyes the color of creek water in summer. He had the look of a working cowboy, lean and weathered, with a kind face that immediately put her at ease. He slowed his horse as he approached, tipping his hat. "Afternoon, miss. That's a long walk in this heat. You headed to Kennewick?" Katherine nodded, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look. "Yes, sir. Name's Fletcher Anderson," he said, swinging down from his horse with easy grace. "I work at the Morrison Ranch just south of town." "You look like you could use some water." He handed her his canteen and Katherine drank gratefully, the water cool and sweet. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson." "Fletcher's fine," he said, studying her with concern. "You running from something or toward something?" "Both, I suppose," Katherine said, handing back the canteen. "I'm Katherine Dalton, or I was. I'm not sure what I am anymore." "Dalton," Fletcher said, recognition flickering in his eyes. "From the big ranch west of here. I've seen your father in town." "Not my father anymore," Katherine said, surprised at the bitterness in her own voice. "He cast me out today." Fletcher's expression darkened. "What kind of man casts out his own daughter? The kind who thinks family tradition is more important than his daughter's happiness," Katherine said. She hadn't meant to say so much, but something about Fletcher's steady gaze made her want to explain. "He wanted me to marry my cousin. I refused." Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, and Katherine braced herself for judgment. Defying your family was serious business in the territory. But when Fletcher spoke, his voice was gentle. "Good," he said. "A woman shouldn't have to marry someone she doesn't want, cousin or not. That takes real courage, Miss Dalton." Katherine felt something loosen in her chest, something she hadn't realized was tight. "I don't know if it's courage or foolishness. I have nowhere to go, no prospects, and $22 to my name." Fletcher looked at her for a long moment, and Katherine saw something shift in his expression, something warm and hopeful. "I know Mrs. Chen, who runs the boarding house in town. She's always looking for help and she's fair to her workers. I could introduce you if you'd like." "You do that for a stranger." "You're not a stranger," Fletcher said, a smile tugging at his lips. "You're Katherine Dalton, the bravest woman I've met in Washington Territory. Now come on, let's get you to town before this sun gets any hotter." He helped her up onto his horse, settling her side saddle in front of him, and Katherine tried to ignore the way her heart raced at his nearness. His arms were solid around her as he held the reins, and she caught the scent of leather and sage and honest sweat. It wasn't unpleasant. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the horse's steady gait rocking them together. Katherine had never been this close to a man who wasn't family, and she found herself hyper-aware of every point of contact, every brush of his arm against hers. "Can I ask you something?" Fletcher said eventually. "Of course. What made you say no?" "A lot of women in your position would have just accepted it." Katherine thought about that. "My grandmother," she said finally. "The one who married her cousin. I remember her just a little. She wasn't happy. I used to see her sitting by the window, staring out at nothing, and I'd wonder what she was thinking about. One time when I was maybe 10, I asked her if she was sad. She looked at me with these empty eyes and said, 'Child, I've been sad so long I don't remember what happy feels like.' I decided right then that I'd never let that happen to me." Fletcher's arms tightened slightly around her. "She'd be proud of you." "I hope so," Katherine said softly. Kennewick wasn't much to look at, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a hotel, and a handful of other buildings. But to Katherine, riding in on Fletcher's horse, it looked like possibility. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was a tidy two-story building at the end of the street, with white curtains in the windows and a small garden out front. Mrs. Chen herself was a small Chinese woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She looked Katherine up and down when Fletcher introduced them, her expression unreadable. "You ever worked a day in your life, girl?" "Yes, madam," Katherine said. "I can cook, clean, mend, and keep accounts. I helped run my family's ranch." "Your family's the Daltons," Mrs. Chen said. "It wasn't a question. Heard about them. Keep to themselves. Why'd they throw you out?" Katherine lifted her chin. "I refused to marry my cousin." Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly. "Good. About time someone in that family showed some sense. I'll give you a trial week." Room and board plus $2. You work out, we'll talk about more. Deal, deal, Katherine said, relief flooding through her. Fletcher tipped his hat to both of them. I'll leave you ladies to it then. But he caught Katherine's eye before he left, and there was something in his gaze that made her pulse quicken. I come into town most Saturdays, Miss Dalton. Maybe I'll see you around. Maybe you will, Mr. Anderson, Katherine said, feeling a smile tug at her lips for the first time all day. The week that followed was the hardest Katherine had ever worked. Mrs. Chen ran a tight ship, and she expected perfection. Katherine scrubbed floors until her knees ached, washed linens until her hands were raw, and cooked meals for the boarders, a rotating cast of ranch hands, merchants and drifters passing through. But she didn't mind. The work was honest, and for the first time in her life she was earning her own way. The other boarders were kind enough. There was old Mr. Peterson, who'd been a trapper up north and told wild stories about grizzly bears. There was Sarah Miller, a young widow who worked at the general store. And there were the ranch hands who came and went, most of them polite, a few of them too forward until Mrs. Chen set them straight with a few sharp words. Katherine didn't see Fletcher that week, but she found herself thinking about him at odd moments. The way he'd looked at her when she told him about her grandmother, the solid warmth of his arms around her on the horse, the kindness in his eyes. She told herself she was being foolish. He was just being neighborly. But still, when Saturday came around, she found herself watching the street from the boarding house windows, her heart jumping every time she saw a rider. He came in the afternoon, tying his horse up outside the general store. Katherine was sweeping the porch when she saw him, and she forced herself to keep working, to not run down the street like some lovesick girl. But when he finished his business at the store and started walking toward the boarding house, she couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. "Miss Dalton," he said, touching his hat, "how'd your first week go?" "Well enough," Katherine said. "Mrs. Chen offered me permanent employment." "That's wonderful," Fletcher said, and the genuine pleasure in his voice warmed her. "I'm glad. I've been thinking about you this week, wondering how you were settling in." "Have you?" Katherine said, feeling bold. "I have," Fletcher admitted, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "In fact, I was hoping maybe you'd let me take you to dinner. There's a decent restaurant by the hotel. Nothing fancy, but the food's good." Katherine's heart raced. "I'd like that, but I should ask Mrs. Chen first." Mrs. Chen, when Katherine found her in the kitchen, gave her a knowing look. "That Anderson boy, he's a good one. Works hard, doesn't drink too much, sends money back to his mother in Oregon. You could do worse. Go on, take your dinner break." The restaurant was small and simple, with checked tablecloths and the smell of roasting meat. Fletcher pulled out Katherine's chair, and they sat across from each other, suddenly shy. But once they started talking, the conversation flowed as easily as it had on the road. Fletcher told her about growing up in Oregon, about coming to Washington Territory 2 years ago to work the ranches. "I'm saving up," he explained. "Want to have my own place someday. Nothing big, just a small spread where I can raise horses. I've always had a way with them." "That sounds wonderful," Katherine said. "Having something that's yours, building something from nothing. Is that what you want too?" Fletcher asked. Katherine thought about it. "I never let myself want things before. Everything in my life was already decided. But now, I don't know. I want to wake up and make my own choices. I want to go to bed knowing I earned my place in the world, and I want to be happy." Fletcher reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm, and Katherine felt a shock of electricity at his touch. "You deserve that," he said. "You deserve all of that." They talked until the restaurant owner gently reminded them he was closing. Fletcher walked Katherine back to the boarding house, and they stood on the porch in the twilight, neither wanting to say good night. "Can I see you again?" Fletcher asked. "I mean more than just Saturday visits." "I'd like that," Katherine said. "I'd like that very much." Fletcher smiled, and in the dim light, Katherine thought he was the most handsome man she'd ever seen. "Good," he said, "because I have to tell you something, and I hope it doesn't scare you off." "What is it?" "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the moment I saw you on that road," Fletcher said, his voice low and earnest. "I know we just met. I know this is fast, but I feel like I've been waiting for you my whole life." Katherine's breath caught. She should be cautious, sensible. But when she looked into Fletcher's eyes, she saw honesty and hope and something that made her want to throw caution to the wind. "I feel it too," she whispered. "I thought I was going crazy." Fletcher laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. "We probably are, but I don't care." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Good night, Katherine. Good night, Fletcher." That night, lying in her small room at the boarding house, Katherine couldn't sleep. Her hand still tingled where Fletcher had kissed it. Her heart felt too big for her chest. A week ago, her life had fallen apart. Now, it felt like it was coming together in ways she'd never imagined. The next months passed in a blur of work and stolen moments with Fletcher. He came to town twice a week now, always finding excuses to visit. They walked together in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his dreams for his ranch, about the horses he wanted to breed, about the house he'd build with his own hands. She told him about the books she'd read, about wanting to see the ocean someday, about the life she was building for herself in Kennewick. Mrs. Chen watched their courtship with approval. "That boy's got it bad for you," she told Katherine one evening. "You could marry worse." "We've only known each other 3 months," Katherine protested, but her cheeks flushed. "When you know," Mrs. Chen said sagely. "I knew my husband 2 weeks before we married. We had 40 good years before he passed." Katherine thought about that conversation later, when Fletcher picked her up for their usual Sunday walk. They headed out of town, following the river, Fletcher's hand warm in hers. The October air was crisp and clean, and the cottonwoods along the riverbank were turning gold. "I need to tell you something," Fletcher said, stopping by a bend in the river. He looked nervous, running his hand through his hair. Katherine's stomach flipped. "What is it?" "I've been saving for 5 years," Fletcher said. "Every penny I could spare, and last week I finally had enough. I bought a piece of land, Katherine. 200 acres, 10 miles south of town. It's got good water, good grass, and a decent line shack I can fix up. It's not much, but it's a start." "Fletcher, that's wonderful," Katherine said, throwing her arms around him. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair. "I want to build a life there," he said. "I want to raise horses and cattle, and I want to build a real house. But Katherine, I don't want to do it alone." Katherine pulled back to look at him, her heart pounding. Fletcher took both her hands in his. "I know we haven't known each other long. I know you just got out of a situation where you were being forced into marriage. The last thing I want is to pressure you. But I love you, Katherine. I've loved you since that first day on the road. And if you'll have me, I want to marry you. I want to build that life with you." Katherine felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears, joyful tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Fletcher, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, right there by the river, and Katherine felt like she was flying. This was what love was supposed to feel like. This was what her grandmother had missed, what she herself had almost lost. This was choice and joy and hope. They were married 3 weeks later in Kennewick's small church, with Mrs. Chen and Sarah Miller as witnesses. Katherine wore a simple blue dress that Sarah had helped her make, and she carried wildflowers that Fletcher had picked that morning. She had no family there, but it didn't matter. She was making her own family now. The wedding night was spent in the hotel, and Katherine was nervous until Fletcher took her face in his hands and said, We have all the time in the world. There's no rush." He was gentle and patient, and when morning came, Katherine woke up in his arms feeling like the luckiest woman alive. They moved to Fletcher's land the next week, and Katherine got her first look at what would be her home. The lined shack was rough, just one room with a stone fireplace and a dirt floor, but Fletcher had cleaned it thoroughly and brought in a real bed, a table, and 2 chairs. "It's not much," he said apologetically, "but I'm going to build you a proper house. 2 stories with a real kitchen and a parlor and a porch where you can sit and watch the sunset. It's perfect," Katherine said, and she meant it. Because it was theirs, built on their own choices, their own dreams. That first winter was hard. Fletcher worked from dawn to dusk building fences, breaking horses, preparing the land. Katherine learned to manage their small home, to cook on the temperamental fireplace, to make their supplies stretch. They were poor, but they were happy. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire, Fletcher working on his plans for the house while Katherine mended or read aloud from the battered books she'd brought from the boarding house. Sometimes they'd just talk, Fletcher's head in Katherine's lap while she ran her fingers through his hair. "Tell me something you want," Fletcher said one night. "Something just for you." Katherine thought about it. "I want chickens," she said. "A whole flock of them, and a milk cow, and maybe a dog." "Chickens, a cow, and a dog," Fletcher said, smiling. "I can manage that." Spring came, and with it, Fletcher broke ground on the new house. He hired a few men from town to help with the heavy work, and Katherine watched their dream take shape beam by beam. The house rose from the prairie like a promise. 2 stories with a wide porch and windows that caught the morning light. It was during this time that Katherine realized she was pregnant. She'd missed her monthly courses twice, and there was a tenderness to her breasts, a slight sickness in the mornings. She was both terrified and thrilled. She waited until she was sure, then told Fletcher one evening as they walked the property line. "I'm going to have a baby," she said simply. Fletcher stopped walking, his face going pale, then flushing with joy. "A baby? Katherine, are you sure?" "I'm sure." He picked her up and spun her around, laughing like a boy. "We're going to have a baby. We need to finish the house. You can't raise a baby in that lined shack. And you need to take it easy, no heavy work. I'll hire someone to help you. Maybe Sarah would come out from town a few days a week." "Fletcher, I'm pregnant, not dying," Katherine said, laughing. But she loved his protectiveness, his immediate concern for her welfare. The house was finished in July, just before the heat became unbearable. It was everything Fletcher had promised and more. Katherine walked through the rooms, her hand on her swelling belly, and felt overwhelming gratitude. This was her home, her real home. They moved in on a Sunday, and that night they lay in their new bedroom, the windows open to catch the breeze. "What should we name the baby?" Fletcher asked, his hand resting on Katherine's stomach. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after your father," Katherine said. "James, then." "And if it's a girl, something strong," Katherine said. "Something that means she can be whoever she wants to be." "Like her mother," Fletcher said, kissing Katherine's temple. The baby came in November, during an early snowstorm that left Fletcher pacing the kitchen while Mrs. Chen and Sarah attended Katherine upstairs. It was a long labor, painful and exhausting, but when Katherine finally heard her baby's cry, every moment of pain was forgotten. "It's a boy," Mrs. Chen said, placing the squalling infant in Katherine's arms. "A big, healthy boy." Fletcher came in moments later, his eyes wide with wonder. "Katherine, are you all right?" "I'm perfect," Katherine said, though she was exhausted. "Come meet your son." Fletcher approached the bed like he was walking on holy ground. He looked down at the baby, and Katherine saw tears in his eyes. "He's beautiful," Fletcher whispered. "He's perfect. Thank you, Katherine. Thank you for him, for this life, for everything." They named him James Fletcher Anderson, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's determination. From the start, he was a loud baby, demanding attention, and Katherine fell in love with him instantly and completely. The first year of James's life was exhausting but joyful. Katherine learned to navigate motherhood, to nurse and soothe and cherish this tiny person who depended on her for everything. Fletcher was a devoted father, getting up with James at night, walking him when he fussed, staring at him like he was the eighth wonder of the world. The ranch grew too. Fletcher's horses were gaining a reputation for quality, and ranchers came from all over the territory to buy from him. Money was still tight, but it was getting easier. They hired a ranch hand, a young man named Tom who was quiet but worked hard. It was in the spring of 1881, when James was learning to walk, that Katherine's past caught up with her. She was hanging laundry in the yard when she saw riders approaching. Her heart seized when she recognized her father's big roan horse. Fletcher came out of the barn, his hand instinctively going to the rifle he kept by the door, but Katherine stopped him. "It's all right," she said, though her voice shook. "I'll handle this." Thomas Dalton looked older than Katherine remembered, his face more lined, his shoulders slightly stooped. Her mother was with him, and her younger brother Matthew, who was 15 now, nearly grown. Jacob wasn't there, and Katherine felt relieved. Thomas dismounted, his eyes taking in the house, the barn, the corrals full of good horses. Katherine saw something flicker in his expression, something that might have been regret. "Katherine," he said gruffly. "Father," she replied, her voice cool. Fletcher came to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "I heard you married," Thomas said. "Heard you have a son." "I do." "This is my husband, Fletcher Anderson." "Fletcher, this is my father, Thomas Dalton, my mother Elizabeth, and my brother Matthew." Fletcher nodded but didn't offer to shake hands. "Mr. Dalton." An awkward silence fell. James, sensing the tension, started to fuss, and Katherine picked him up, settling him on her hip. "He looks healthy," Elizabeth said softly, tears in her eyes. "May I?" Katherine hesitated, then handed James to her mother. Elizabeth held her grandson carefully, like he was made of glass, tears streaming down her face. Thomas cleared his throat. "We came to tell you that Jacob left. Went to California, last we heard. The marriage, it's not an issue anymore." "It was never an issue," Katherine said firmly. "I made my choice and I stand by it." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "I can see that. You've built a good life here, better than what you had with us, maybe." "Definitely better," Katherine said. There was no bitterness in her voice, just simple truth. "Your mother misses you," Thomas said, and for the first time, Katherine heard something vulnerable in his voice. "She asks about you all the time." Katherine looked at her mother, who was cooing at James, and felt her anger soften just slightly. "You're welcome to visit," she said carefully. "As long as you respect my choices and my husband." "We do," Elizabeth said quickly. "We just want to be part of your life again, if you'll let us." Katherine looked at Fletcher, who gave her a small nod. It was her choice, her decision. "All right," she said. "You can visit. But this is my home, my family. You need to understand that." "We do," Thomas said. And though Katherine wasn't sure she fully believed him, she saw the beginning of acceptance in his eyes. Her family visited twice more that year, brief visits that were awkward but gradually warmed. Matthew, especially, loved James and would play with him for hours. Elizabeth taught Katherine some old family recipes and brought gifts for the baby. Thomas remained gruff, but Katherine could see him struggling to accept the life she'd chosen. It was enough. Katherine didn't need her father's approval anymore, but it was nice to have her mother back in her life, even in this limited way. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered. Fletcher's reputation as a horseman grew, and their herd increased. They hired more help and built a bigger barn. Catherine's chickens multiplied and she sold eggs in town. The milk cow Fletcher had promised her became 3 milk cows. In 1883, Catherine got pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, her labor shorter. She gave birth to a daughter in the summer, a tiny girl with Fletcher's green eyes and Catherine's light hair. "What should we name her?" Fletcher asked, cradling his daughter in his big hands. "Rose," Catherine said, "after the wild roses that grow by the river where you proposed." "Rose Anderson," Fletcher said, trying it out. "It's perfect." Rose was a calmer baby than James had been, content to be held and watch the world. James, at 3, was fascinated by his new sister and wanted to help with everything. Catherine's heart felt so full she thought it might burst. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The children grew. The ranch thrived. Fletcher built additions to the house, a larger kitchen, a proper dining room. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. In 1885, Matthew came to work for them. He was 18 now, almost a man, and he'd had his own falling out with Thomas over wanting to strike out on his own. Fletcher welcomed him, taught him the horse business, and Catherine was grateful to have her brother close. "Thank you," Matthew told her one evening, "for showing me it was possible to leave, to choose your own life." "You would have figured it out on your own," Catherine said, "but I'm glad you're here." That same year, Thomas died suddenly of a heart attack. Catherine went to the funeral, Fletcher and the children with her. She stood by her father's grave and felt a complicated mix of grief and relief and forgiveness. He hadn't been a good father, but he'd been trying, at the end, to be better. Elizabeth moved to a small house in Kennewick after that, unable to manage the ranch alone. The property was sold, the Dalton legacy divided. Elizabeth visited Catherine often, and she was a devoted grandmother, baking cookies for James and Rose, teaching them songs and stories. Time passed, as it does. James grew tall and lean like his father, fascinated by horses and the land. Rose was quiet but determined, always reading, always asking questions. In 1890, when Catherine was 32 and thought her family was complete, she found herself pregnant again. "Are you happy about it?" Fletcher asked, his hand on her belly. "I am," Catherine said, and she meant it. Surprised, but happy. This baby was another boy born in the spring of 1891. They named him Thomas after Catherine's father, a gesture of peace and forgiveness. He was a happy baby, laughing easily, curious about everything. Fletcher, at 38, still worked the ranch every day, but he'd learned to take time for his family too. Sunday afternoons were sacred, reserved for family dinners and walks and sitting on the porch watching the children play. One Sunday evening, after the children were in bed, Fletcher and Catherine sat on the porch swing, watching the sun set over their land. Fletcher had his arm around Catherine, and she leaned into his warmth, contentment washing over her. "You ever regret it?" Fletcher asked suddenly. "Leaving your family, starting over with nothing?" "Never," Catherine said without hesitation. "Not for a single moment. That day on the road when you found me, that was the day my real life started." "Mine too," Fletcher said, kissing the top of her head. "I think about that day sometimes. About how I almost rode right past you. I'd finished my business in town early and I was taking the back road home. If I'd left 10 minutes later or taken the main road, I never would have met you." "Fate," Catherine said. "Love," Fletcher corrected. "I took one look at you, standing there in the dust, looking lost and brave and beautiful, and I knew you were going to change my life." "Good," Catherine said, tilting her face up for a kiss. "Now you can marry me." Fletcher laughed, recognizing the echo of what he'd said years ago. "I already did, in case you forgot." "I remember," Catherine said, smiling against his lips. "Best decision I ever made." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out. James would be 10 this year, old enough to start really helping on the ranch. Rose was 7, already reading books meant for children twice her age. Thomas was crawling, getting into everything, keeping Katherine on her toes. "Tell me what you want now," Fletcher said, echoing a question he'd asked years ago. Katherine thought about it. She had her home, her husband, her children. She had reconciliation with her mother, peace with her past. She had work that mattered and a life she'd chosen. "I want this," she said simply. "More days like this, more years with you. I want to watch our children grow up. I want to grow old with you on this porch." "That's easy," Fletcher said, "because that's exactly what we're going to do." And they did. The years continued to unfold, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick animals and broken equipment, all the usual struggles of ranch life. But through it all, Fletcher and Katherine faced everything together. James grew into a fine young man, taking over more of the ranch work as Fletcher got older. He was courting a girl from town, a sweet thing named Emma, and Fletcher and Katherine both approved. Rose decided she wanted to be a teacher and started studying with the schoolteacher in Kennewick. Thomas was still young, but already showing signs of being a natural horseman like his father. In 1898, Katherine was 40 years old, and Fletcher threw her a surprise party. The house was full of friends and neighbors. Matthew and his new wife, Elizabeth looking frail but happy, Mrs. Chen and Sarah and people from town. James had brought Emma, and Rose had made a cake that leaned slightly to one side but tasted wonderful. Speech. Someone called, and Katherine found herself standing in the middle of her parlor, surrounded by people she loved. 20 years ago, she said, her voice thick with emotion, I walked away from everything I knew with nothing but a bag of clothes and $22. I thought my life was over. But I met a man on a dusty road who showed me kindness when I needed it most, and that man gave me everything. A home, a family, a life worth living. So thank you, Fletcher Anderson, for being the best thing that ever happened to me. Fletcher pulled her into his arms and their friends cheered. Later, when everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, they sat on their porch as they had so many times before. 20 years, Fletcher marveled. Feels like 20 minutes and 20 lifetimes all at once. I know what you mean, Katherine said. She looked out at the ranch, at the barn and the corrals and the land they'd built their life on. In the distance, she could see the lights of Kennewick, the town that had given her a second chance. You think James will propose to Emma soon? Fletcher asked. I think so. He's been saving up for a ring. They'll probably want to build their own place eventually. We should give them the south section where the creek runs. Good water there. That's generous, Katherine said. It's practical, Fletcher countered. We want them close. And there's plenty of land for all of us. Katherine smiled. This was who Fletcher was, always thinking ahead, always planning for family. What about Rose? She's talking about going to college. Then we'll find a way to send her, Fletcher said firmly. Our daughter's smart. She should have every opportunity. And Thomas will probably take over the ranch someday if he wants it, but that's years away. For now, he's just a boy who needs to do his homework and stop sneaking extra cookies from the jar. They laughed together, and Katherine felt a deep sense of peace. This was her life, the one she'd chosen, the one she'd built with her own hands and heart. It hadn't always been easy, but it had been worth every struggle. The next years brought more changes. James married Emma in a beautiful ceremony at the church, and they moved to their own house on the south section. A year later, they made Fletcher and Katherine grandparents with the birth of a daughter. Rose got her teaching certificate and took a position at the Kennewick School. Thomas, at 12, was indeed a natural horseman, able to gentle the most stubborn colts. Elizabeth passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1902, and Katherine mourned the mother who had finally become her friend. They buried her next to Thomas, and Katherine left flowers on both graves. Fletcher was 50 by then, his hair going gray, but he was still strong, still working the ranch every day. Katherine was 44, her hair threaded with silver laugh lines around her eyes. They looked like what they were, a couple who had lived and loved and built something lasting. In 1904, Rose got married to a young lawyer from Walla Walla, and they moved there so he could start his practice. Katherine cried at the wedding, but they were happy tears. Her daughter had choices, opportunities Katherine had never dreamed of at that age. "We did good," Fletcher said, watching Rose dance with her new husband. "We did," Katherine agreed. Thomas was 16 now, as tall as his father and completely devoted to the horses. He had his father's gift with them, that quiet patience that made even the wildest horse trust him. He'd already said he wanted to stay on the ranch, to expand the breeding program, and Fletcher was teaching him everything he knew. One evening in the spring of 1906, Katherine and Fletcher took a rare evening alone. Thomas was spending the night at James's place, helping with some fence repair. The house was quiet, just the two of them. They made love slowly, tenderly, with the ease of long practice and deep love. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Fletcher's fingers tracing lazy patterns on Katherine's arm. "I love you," he said, as he had said 1,000 times before. "I love you too," Katherine replied, as she always did. "You remember what you said to me once?" Fletcher asked. "About your grandmother, how she'd been sad so long she forgot what happy felt like, I remember." "I want you to know," Fletcher said, his voice serious. "I have never forgotten what happy feels like. Because of you, because of this life, I'm happy every single day." Katherine felt tears sting her eyes. "Me too," she whispered. "Me too." The years continued their steady march. James and Emma had 3 more children, keeping Katherine busy with grandchildren to spoil. Rose and her husband had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and visited several times a year. Thomas married a neighboring rancher's daughter in 1910, a capable woman named Clara who loved the ranch as much as he did. Fletcher and Katherine settled into the rhythm of their later years. They worked less, delegated more to Thomas and James. They spent their days on the porch, watching their grandchildren play, talking about the past and dreaming about the future. In 1915, Katherine was 57, Fletcher 62. They'd been married 36 years, together for 37. The ranch was thriving under Thomas's management. Their children and grandchildren were healthy and happy, and Katherine felt blessed beyond measure. One Sunday afternoon, their entire family gathered for dinner. James and Emma with their 4 children, Thomas and Clara with their 2, Rose visiting with her husband and children from Walla Walla. The house was full of noise and laughter, children running everywhere, the smell of roast beef and fresh bread filling the air. After dinner, everyone gathered on the porch and in the yard. The adults sat in chairs and on the porch railing while the children played tag in the twilight. Fletcher had his arm around Katherine, and she leaned into him, watching this family they'd created. "Grandma," one of Rose's children called, "tell us the story of how you met Grandpa." "Oh, you've heard that story 100 times, Katherine protested. "We want to hear it again," the children chorused. Katherine looked at Fletcher, who smiled and nodded. So she told the story once more, about the day she was cast out for refusing to marry her cousin, about walking that dusty road alone, about the cowboy who stopped to help her. "And he said," Katherine concluded, looking at Fletcher with all the love in her heart, "Good, now you can marry me." The children giggled, as they always did. The adults smiled, having heard the story many times but never tiring of it. "That's not quite how it happened," Fletcher interjected, as he always did. "I said I loved you and asked you to marry me properly." "The story's better my way," Katherine teased. "Everything's better your way," Fletcher said, kissing her temple. As the evening deepened and the stars came out, Katherine looked around at her family, at the life she and Fletcher had built together. She thought about that girl on the dusty road, frightened and alone but refusing to compromise her future. She thought about the cowboy who had seen her worth when her own family didn't. She thought about all the years since, the struggles and triumphs, the children born and raised, the ranch built from nothing into something lasting. She thought about growing old with the man she loved, about the choice she'd made all those years ago that had led to this moment. "What are you thinking about?" Fletcher asked softly, as if sensing her thoughts. "Everything," Katherine said. "How one choice, one moment of courage can change everything. How you can lose one family and build another. How love, real love, is always worth fighting for." "Agreed," Fletcher said. "Though I'd argue I got the better end of that deal. You gave up everything for your freedom. I just got lucky enough to be on that road at the right time." "We both got lucky," Katherine said firmly. "We found each other. We built this. And I wouldn't change a single thing. Not one thing." Fletcher asked, a teasing note in his voice. "Not even that first winter in the line shack when we were so poor we had beans for dinner 6 nights a week." "Not even that," Katherine said, laughing. "Because we were together, because we were happy, because it was ours." The party broke up eventually, children yawning, adults gathering coats and hats. There were hugs and kisses all around, promises to visit soon, James and Thomas conferring about ranch business. Finally, it was just Fletcher and Katherine again, sitting on their porch as the night grew deep around them. 62 years old, Fletcher mused. "Never thought I'd make it this far." "You'll make it to 100, Katherine said confidently. "Too stubborn to do otherwise." "Only if you're there with me," Fletcher said. "Promise me, Katherine. Promise me we'll grow old together just like this." "I promise," Katherine said, "now and always." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from decades of love and understanding. Somewhere in the barn, a horse nickered. An owl hooted from the cottonwood by the creek. The night wind rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. This was home. This was family. This was the life Katherine had chosen when she walked away from everything she knew. And it was more, so much more than she'd ever dared to dream. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "For what? For stopping that day. For helping a stranger. For loving me." Fletcher turned her face toward his eyes reflecting the starlight. "Thank you for being brave enough to walk away. For being strong enough to start over. For building this life with me." He kissed her then, a long, slow kiss that still made her heart race after all these years. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "Come on," Fletcher said, standing and offering his hand. "Let's go to bed. Morning comes early." "It always does," Katherine said, taking his hand and letting him pull her up. They walked into their house, the home they'd built together, turning off lamps as they went. In their bedroom, they undressed and climbed into bed, Fletcher pulling Katherine close against him, her head on his chest, his arms around her. "I love you, Katherine Anderson," Fletcher murmured, already half asleep. "I love you, Fletcher Anderson," Katherine replied. And as she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, in the house they'd built, on the land they'd claimed, surrounded by the family they'd created, Katherine thought about that young woman on the dusty road all those years ago. That girl who'd had the courage to say no to a life she didn't want, who'd been brave enough to say yes to an uncertain future. She wanted to tell that girl that everything would be all right, that the road would be hard but worth it. That love, when you found the right person, was everything the poets said it was and more. That home wasn't about where you came from, but about what you built with your own hands and heart. But that girl was gone now, transformed by time and love into the woman Katherine had become. A woman who had lived and loved fully, who had raised children and built a legacy, who had found happiness in the most unexpected places. As sleep claimed her, Katherine's last thought was simple but profound. She had chosen well. She had chosen love. She had chosen life. And that had made all the difference. The years that followed were gentle ones. Fletcher and Katherine watched their grandchildren grow, some of them eventually having children of their own. They saw their ranch prosper and expand, saw Kennewick grow from a small settlement into a thriving town. They saw the 20th century bring changes they'd never imagined, automobiles and electricity, and all manner of modern conveniences. Through it all, they remained constant. Fletcher and Katherine, Katherine and Fletcher, two people who had found each other on a dusty road and built a lifetime together. They grew old gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year, their companionship growing richer with time. Fletcher lived to be 78, passing peacefully in his sleep in 1931. Katherine held his hand as he took his last breath, and though her heart broke, she was grateful for every moment they'd had together. 49 years of marriage, 50 years of love, a lifetime of happiness. She lived another 5 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the matriarch of a large and loving family. She told her stories often, about the old days, about building the ranch, about the cowboy who had rescued her on a dusty road. When Katherine Dalton Anderson passed away in 1936 at the age of 78, she was buried next to Fletcher on a hill overlooking the ranch they'd built together. The entire town came to her funeral, along with family from all over Washington and Oregon, all there to pay respects to a woman who had lived with courage and grace. Her grandson, James's oldest son, stood at her graveside and told the story one last time. About the girl who refused to marry her cousin and was cast out by her family. About the cowboy who found her on the road and said, "Good, now you can marry me." About the love story that had begun in hardship and ended in triumph. And as the sun set over the ranch, over the land that Katherine and Fletcher had claimed and cultivated, over the family they had created, it was clear that their legacy would endure. Not just in the land or the horses or the buildings, but in the example they'd set. The example of choosing love over obligation, courage over fear, hope over despair. They had lived well. They had loved deeply. And their story would be told for generations to come. A reminder that sometimes the best life is the one you choose for yourself, and that true love is always worth the risk.